The American Revolution, in other words, is never finished. It must always be renewed.
Greater love than this hath no man, than that he lay down his life for his friend.
What if it's not envy?
We must take back our cities, and take back our culture, and take back our country. God bless you, and God bless America.
Let's roll. All right. So welcome everybody to another episode of Contra Mundum. This is one of our premium interviews, and we're very happy to welcome an old friend of our libertarian years.
Yes.
And, you know, he's a great guy. He was Ron Paul's chief of staff and a number of other different things that he can tell you about. But Jeff Deist, thank you for joining us.
It is great to see you guys again.
All right, Jeff. So we have a lot to talk about today. You know, one of the things that I wanted to catch up with you on is this phenomenon of Trump. And I know he's sort of a very talked about person, obviously, but, you know, we're curious about things where you were in Ron Paul's office for a number of different years. So you've kind of seen the whole populist thing happen at the very beginning, you know, just as it was gaining steam at the end of the, financial crisis. So I wanted to get a little bit of your perspective on all that, you know, how the sausage is made in politics, what you think of Trump, and also this growing trajectory among younger people, especially like Ron Paul veterans going toward the right wing. So I wanted to help make sense of all this stuff. So just to kick things off a little bit, why don't you, if you could just summarize what you did for Ron Paul and then maybe where you've gone from there, intellectually or otherwise.
Well, it's pretty remarkable to look at the U.S. House, that joint session of Congress recently, and the reaction by some of the Democrats. I mean, it really is a radically different House of Representatives than when I was up there working for Ron in the 2000s. I was his chief of staff, and just the difference in decorum, the difference in the representatives themselves. I mean, the House was always a step below the Senate. People in the Senate were generally wealthier. They had more Ivy League pedigrees. Generally more intelligent, more accomplished in life. And the House was a little bit more raucous, where the guy who owned 5 car dealerships in an area became the congressman, that sort of thing. But what's happened in the last 20 years since I left, or 15 years, whatever it's been, is pretty radical. That the House no longer really functions, which I think is a good thing. That's what I want. and not from some libertarian sense, but just because I want bad people to suffer for their badness, and part of that is pulling the American public out of its stupor, which I think is happening, and so I'm very pleased with that. But there are people now in the U.S. House of Representatives who are abject idiots, morons, really subhuman people, and that's a reflection of the electorate, and so. Yeah. I think that's something we have to grapple with. Now, you mentioned populism. That is a huge element. I think it's entirely deserved. Let's not forget that elites screwed everything up. Elites ruined the 20th century. They took the golden 19th century and turned it into a century of war and central banking and social insurance and nation building and neoconservatism, and they ruined medicine, they ruined banking, they ruined education, they ruined money. I mean, people say, like, what's with this populism? Well, that's your answer. It's entirely deserved. The elites deserve to be rejected, and that doesn't mean we don't need new elites. We radically do, and I think that's a lot of the growing pains that we're feeling. But working for Ron was interesting because Ron was a real outsider then. I mean, there's a few generations now of Ron Paul fans. I'm an older generation, but what a lot of people don't know is that he spent years and years in the wilderness, really poorly treated by the Republican Party. I mean, when he came into Congress, almost all of the Texas delegation was Democrats. Yeah. And so he stuck his neck out a little bit in '76 and endorsed Reagan. And ever since then, he's always a maverick and a firebrand, and very well liked on a personal level by members of Congress. But he spent a lot of years going and talking to tiny groups and trying to get a sound money newsletter out there and working on things that today are much easier to work on because of digital communications. And so a lot of people who are under, let's say, 30 or 40, they only know Ron as this kind of celebrity, this really sweet older guy and this and that. But you guys have seen him back on Morton Downey and things like that. And so there was a lot of sausage making to become the Ron Paul that we know today.
Yeah. One of the things I'm curious about is at the end of Ron Paul's time, it kind of almost seemed very hopeless. The atmosphere was very different than it is right now. And, I went offline for a few years after that. What year did he leave Congress? Was that 2016? When was that?
No, he left at the end of 2012.
At the end of 2012. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's kind of when I started disengaging too. It's like, this isn't going anywhere. Libertarian politics is kind of a fool's errand. And then, you come back and you see people like Dave Smith and Michael Malice and some of these others that were like just sort of like on the periphery. They're like kind of big names now. And they're talking to like Joe Rogan and other people. So I'm just curious, like, do you think Ron anticipated any part of the Trump phenomenon?
Well, he predated it and in many ways presaged it. And he's very pleased and flattered by, whatever notoriety or credit he's getting today from Elon Musk or people talking about Doge or people talking about the Fed or auditing Fort Knox gold and that sort of thing. But to understand things, and I felt that same despondence that you felt, if you want to understand the Wilson era, you have to go back to the, post-Civil War 1880s progressive roots to understand that. If you want to understand FDR and the New Deal, you have to go back to the Wilson era. If you want to understand what's happening with Trump today, you really have to go back to people like Ron Paul and Ralph Nader and Pat Buchanan, and Ross Perot. And then you could even go back to, if you want to understand Reagan, maybe you have to go back to Goldwater. So these things take time. And I think the ideal for those of us who think the way we do is to understand that we have low time preference. We're trying to build things. We're trying to build structures that last beyond our lifetimes. And we shouldn't be childish in seeking instant gratification. And God knows not through politics, at least of all.
Yeah. One of the things like that's really interesting to me about Ron Paul is, he had all of these great like outsiders as part of his staff. I mean, he had, I forget all their names now, but like the people on foreign policy, the people on monetary policy, he had all these great people. And after he left, I mean, they basically all left Washington. And one of the questions I had is, are any of them still around? Are any of them still operating within the Trump administration at all? Or are they just kind of like gone and on their own way?
Well, not really. I think the idea that we all left Washington was a healthy one. We weren't like these sick Cato types or somebody who just hang around there for 30 years and pretend to be above it all when they're below it. So we meaning Ron's staff, we weren't people who were looking to go work for another member of Congress or go work for a think tank or something. And so, Daniel McAdams is still with Ron, but he's down in Texas. He runs the Liberty Report, which is a YouTube show every day. And Daniel's pretty acerbic on Twitter, which I like to see. Daniel spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, and he especially Hungary, and so he understands the populist European right pretty well. And he's also a deep Catholic, and I like to see that kind of influence around Ron. But for the most part, to the extent the Ron Paul revolution lives on, I think it's pretty scattered to the wind.
Yeah. Do you think that there's any does he? I know he always had somewhat of an optimistic cadence about him, which always surprised me. Does he think things are heading in the right direction at all, or because he never comes across as defeated? And if anyone should be defeated, it's Ron Paul. Yeah. But he's still doing do you ever talk to him about the Trump phenomenon?
I have a little bit. He was actually offered towards the very end of the campaign, right before the election itself, when some of those big rallies were happening in Pennsylvania and some of the swing states, he was offered an opportunity to go up and be on stage after Trump and Elon had said some nice things about him. I think he declined because he felt like that would basically be viewed as an endorsement, and fairly enough. and perhaps he wasn't ready for that. I wish he had personally,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, Ron's just wired different. I mean, you have to understand growing up. He's born in 35 in Pittsburgh. 35 is also the same year as Elvis. So it's kind of, it's not World War II. It's a little below that. They call it the silent generation. And, you know, his father was a real Depression era guy who ran a dairy, where the kind where you drove around in a truck and delivered milk bottles to people's actual doorstep. And so those are Ron's early memories. And he's just always had a very sunny disposition. And when he decided to go into medicine, you know, was at the time when the Korean conflict was happening. So rather than be drafted towards the end of his medical school career, this actually screwed him up for a couple of years. It put him behind in his training. Rather than be drafted under duress, he enlisted in order to be a flight surgeon and an officer in the Air Force. And you know, that period, among other things, during the Korean conflict, he was in Afghanistan and saw what had happened there with the British. And that period is what really made him very pro-life, and what made him want to be an OBGYN and, you know, help women, you know, bring life into the world and help people. And he made a decision that he wouldn't want to carry a gun or shoot people or whatever. So, you know, Ron is so unlike how the left has portrayed him over the years. You know, the Slates and the Salons and the Mother Joneses who view him as this right-wing crank. I mean, he's a very nice, genial man, a very, very non-judgmental. But his real legacy, you know, this is what people sleep on, is his real legacy is not going to be having delivered 4,000 babies, which is infinitely more important than being in Congress. It's not even going to be his 2 presidential runs. It's going to be his 5 kids, his, you know, 35 grandchildren, thereabouts, going on 8 great-grandchildren. That's the real legacy. When, you know, Ron and Carol have almost a 60-year marriage now, 60-ish year marriage. And that's just unmatched, especially amongst politicians. And I think there's a huge lesson here for Ron Paul fans, as it starts at home.
Yeah. All right, one more question and I'll end you talk. But one of the things I really wanted to ask you was, what does Trump mean to you? I mean, obviously it's hilarious to see the journalists, you know, melting down, to see, you know, like Adam Kissinger crying every day on Twitter. Like, that's all great.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you think this is just a lot of like headline hype, or do you think there's actually something going on here that's going to be sustainably beneficial?
Oh, I think there's something going on, and it's not per se about Trump and his personnel and his cabinet. It's not per se about his policies, if you want to call them that. I mean, this is a guy who is blissfully, and I would say thankfully, you know, not ideological. That's one of his great. That's one of his great strengths. That's one of the things I love about him. But the real import behind the Trump phenomenon is that, you know, both in 2016 against Hillary and now in 2024, you know, that many million Americans were willing to go off script and vote for this guy. And let's remember, there was a progressive arc. You know, Hillary Clinton was just going to be the first female president, and we were going to continue with this sort of neoliberal post-war consensus. And it turns out now, especially in light of what we're finding out about the media and, you know, through groups like USAID, AID, is the post-war consensus was fake. It never existed. The old right was right. Most people agreed with the old right. And the post-war consensus was a manufactured elite propaganda thing that was imposed upon us. It didn't come up bottom up naturally. You know, the idea that we should have these sort of liberal social democracies around the world, and that the West is the model. And then after the Cold War, especially after '89, that the United States should be the unipolar head of all of this. You know, I mean, nobody bought this stuff, this Francis Fukuyama end of history stuff. Nobody bought the neoconservative line. And the idea that was the, you know, animating impulse of the American right was just, it was the animating impulse of the Beltway, and that's about it. And so, you know, people will put up with a lot as long as the economy's pretty good. I mean, that's just the reality. And they'll, they'll even support, yeah, we got to get Saddam and we got to go kill those terrorists over there. But I think Trump has really demonstrated that enough people understand or feel the rot,
Mm-hmm.
and they may not completely understand what caused the rot. They may not completely understand how to solve the rot, and none of us do. It's a big problem. Mm-hmm. It's a multifaceted, multi-decade project. But nonetheless, they felt it. And the fact that they felt it and acted on that, I think, says a hell of a lot about that there's still a pulse in this country.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, I mean, piggybacking on that, what you say, nobody knows how to solve it. Hey, which is true. I mean, it's this Gordian knot, right, that can't be unfurled by any one person. But at the same time, right, so many chickens are coming home to roost after 60 or 80 years of economic destruction, mass migration, social engineering of the entire society, and just breaking everything down. And then on top of that, we mentioned, maybe it was off air before, but like the fiscal problems are eventually they're going to be real, right?
And
right.
Nothing's actually been solved. Like all this Doge savings, it's like, I don't even know if it's even worth talking about, because the numbers are so astronomical and kind of Looney Tunes that even the Doge cuts, it's like, is that actually solvency?
Yeah, like billions of dollars is like saving a few cents each month on your mortgage, right? And so, so like the fiscal issue, I mean, it is one that's this sort of Damocles that hangs over everything. And so that, but it's one where it's like, okay, 20 years ago, people are saying, yeah, any minute now, the entire world economy is going to collapse because we can't fund Social Security or whatever. But they're always able to manipulate things. They're always able to, sell bonds or whatever, monetary, games that they play. Right. But eventually those things will not work. Right. Whether it's 20 years from now or 50 years from now. Right. That will, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and this is definitely your wheelhouse here, Jeff, but I think, right, that those things are like something is going to happen eventually, right? Maybe in our lifetimes, where none of this will ever be tenable again. And so, right, can that be forestalled? Can that be changed? Can it be turned around? I mean, even the idea of having a universal mass democracy where half the country gets paid off by the other half, right? Like nobody's gonna vote against that. Like, yeah, I'm gonna cut all the free stuff. Like that's never going to win. Like, obviously, so it's not going to come through a political process, it'll come through a political process, but not an electoral one. So, right. I mean, what do you think that looks like over the next 40 years? Right. I mean, it's for a very broad question, but well, like the temperature is going to get cranked up.
Andrew's seeking financial advice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's unpayable. And look, if we pressed a button tomorrow and made the 36 trillion debt go away, that wouldn't deal with the unfunded future pension liabilities, which are off balance sheet in a way that would get any private sector CEO thrown in prison. Yeah. By the way, under Sarbanes-Oxley, but we have a gap of depending on which economist you listen to. Lawrence Kotlikoff, who's an economist at Princeton, factors in about 200 trillion. In other words, the net present value of the future taxes we're likely to bring in over, let's say, the next 30 to 50 years under even a rosy economic scenario versus the net present value of all those entitlement payments. So, $200 trillion is it's just a crazy number. So that can be pretty daunting to people. And it's so important to remember that one of the reasons we can't solve things is because we're not a country. Yeah, we're certainly not a nation by any definition. What we are is an economic arrangement. That's all America is at this point. I'm sure a lot of your listeners know the name Ilana Mercer. She writes in a few different places, but she coined this phrase "Walmart with nukes," and to describe the United States. And so what it is America is a place where the economic material things work pretty well. The hot and cold running water and appliances and energy. And, we have a great supply chain, and we have Amazon, and we have all these other things, and we have Starbucks everywhere. And things pretty much work on a day-to-day basis. And so that's I'm not scoffing at that. That's not nothing. I mean, go to Johannesburg, where things used to work, and you'll see where you'd rather live real quick. And so, but that's a lot. Materialism is not nothing, but it's not enough.
Yeah.
And we're learning that in a painful way. And so 330 million people, which the elites are trying to make more and more multiracial, multicultural BS, open borders, immigration, that's just going to intensify and get worse and worse, because as the economic problems ratchet up, you'll fall into basically tribal group voting at first, and then perhaps something worse than that later. So the obvious answer, as Rothbard understood, is first of all default. That's the only moral thing for the federal government to do is to default on this past debt, which somebody else ran out. First and foremost, so we don't have to worry about that. And then some pretty severe and painful cuts. And I'm Gen X, so part of me doesn't mind this piling on the boomers. They're I mean, as a group, they're pretty despicable in some significant ways. Let's be frank. But there's also that's not universal across boomers, of course. And despicable or not, there's a lot of little old ladies who really do need that piddling $1,800 a month from Social Security or whatever. So for starters, it's awfully hard. It's basically a political non-starter to be cutting that. The dirty little secret is that there's a staggering number of boomers in this country who actually have a very quiet, $1 to $5 million net worth. These aren't wealthy people in certain sense. But their house is paid for. They have a 401k. They have certain stocks and bonds, and so they have, let's say, a $1 to $5 million net worth, depending on where their house is or whatever, and they're still getting that $2-3 grand a month. So that is just absolutely criminal, and they will tell you I paid into it, which is just absolute nonsense. And anybody who says that should just be dismissed and ridiculed. But nonetheless, I mean, that's politically the boomers are a big generation and they vote. So I guess from the entitlement perspective, I'm not sure how we get through that, especially if a lot of them live into their 90s. And but nonetheless, what is definitely coming is a day when all the baby boomers will be gone, and anyone who has even a childhood memory of World War II will be gone.
Yeah.
And so, I think given the historical illiteracy of Americans generally, that's hopefully going to assist us in really getting rid of this post-war consensus nonsense fully and finally. But I don't have a good answer for you, Andrew. That's the economic thing is the only thing holding us together.
I also I think that something much more radical has to be done if you're gonna deal with those things. Like, my own position is basically just liquidate the assets of the CIA. I mean, just liquidate the assets. But what my point is, you can pay for some of these things. The people on the most desperate situations among the Social Security recipients, you can pay for some of those things just by making radical changes within the intelligence and military expenditures.
No, I mean, if you had a king with unilateral power, right? I mean, you could solve these problems. If you
just have to do a one-time transfer of obligations.
Yeah.
I mean, make the Dick Cheneys of the world pay for it. You know what I mean? Right.
Well, I mean, there have been other things where it's like, okay, well, all the federal land could be sold
I
and
don't
things
like
like
that,
that.
man. Like,
I know you really don't.
I used to like it.
I'm a mixed bag on that because right, I don't want it to get sold to people to like clear cut it
Exactly.
or to
Yeah.
develop it.
Like Howard Schultz is going
Mhm.
to like own everything,
Yeah, I mean, if you
and
sold it
it's
to
all
like,
going to be like purple-haired Indians.
yeah, if you sold it to like individual American citizens, right?
Yeah.
Per social security number, they get a certain amount. Like they could buy 100 acres, right? Like if you did it that way, maybe. But even that, like there are assets that can be sold off.
Mhm.
There's plenty of federal buildings and things like that that are totally
Mhm.
useless that can be sold. But even that, like, what do you net? You know, a couple $1 trillion, and we're talking like 200 trillion.
Well, I mean, you have to renege on a lot of the agreements, but I'm talking
Yeah.
about the most desperate, the old ladies that need the $1,800.
Mhm.
That's different than the people that have their house paid off, right?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is like when it's push come to shove, right? When like either like you default entirely and none of it gets paid for, or you have to triage it and practice austerity. But even when you get to that situation, right, will there be political will to do that? Probably not,
exactly.
right? And so I look at it. I mean, some of the things that you're saying, Jeff, like when you have a country like ours where it's been socially engineered into being, you know, multicultural, that can work out when things are good, right? Economically, when everybody has all, you know, when the getting is good, like that's fine. You things will be okay. But you look at a place when the pressure is cranked way up, right? It turns into, you know, Bosnia or the Balkans in the 90s, right?
Yes.
And that I think is what is going to come to America when the fiscal pressure boils over. And it's like that is probably going, unless drastic radical things happen
Yeah.
in like the next decade. That is probably what we're looking at in the future. And so within the context of all of that, right? It makes me, you know, just think about the Trump phenomenon as a whole, especially because we talked about how like we were Ron Paul guys in like 2008 and 2012, and in the libertarian world,
Mhm.
I probably read every PDF on Mises.org. You know, I didn't even have Jeff Riggenbach read them to me. I read them myself, and just consumed all of those things, and they were great. And then 2015 happened, and Trump is running, and it is so, you know, blatantly obvious to me how big the immigration issue was. It broke me out of the, you know, like the libertarian idea where it's like, well, you know, free exchange of goods and services, right? Borders, we shouldn't have them because, right, the free market fixes this. And it's like, well, we don't have that. Right. And like people are not fungible economic units. Right. And so I see that. And I mean, the biggest thing for me, like personally, was probably the summer of 2015, reading Justin Raimondo that summer, and how like all the entire media was after Trump, and they didn't really turn on Trump that summer until he started saying things like, why are we NATO? There's a lot of rich countries that don't pay anything. We should get out of NATO. And they lost their minds over that when he was critical of the Iraq war, when he's critical of the foreign policy of the last 20 or 30 years. And so then Raimondo is like defending him and saying like, actually, no, this is great. Like all of you libertarians that hate Trump, you shouldn't, because this is like if Ron Paul had been leading the polls by the same margin Trump was, right, this is exactly what the media would be doing to him, right? They would be attacking him entirely over foreign policy. And it, because of his like enemies that he was gaining, I'm like, oh, I think he's the real deal. Or if he's not the real deal, right, he's summoning something in America. And like the moment, I think he was at like the South Carolina Republican debate, which was always notorious when Ron Paul did that debate, right?
Yes.
He fights with Rudy Giuliani and he gets booed for telling the truth about 9/11 and the war on terror. And Trump goes there in 2015, 7 years later, it basically says the same thing, but he's just really bombastic and like Teddy Roosevelt-esque, speak softly and carry a big stick. Like, yeah, we got to stop nation building, but if they mess with us, we'll bomb them to smithereens. But the Iraq war was a mistake. And the same people, same crowd is like, yeah, going crazy. And so I'm like, oh, wow. Like he's able to say like 90% of the same stuff as Ron did, as pertains foreign policy, and get the same people that hated Ron to like cheer for him. It was remarkable. And
So something happened.
I think he summoned something in the American right and dredged up something. And it's not because like he was reading, Pat Buchanan, like famously, like he called Pat Buchanan a Nazi or something in the 90s, right? Like, it wasn't like he was reading Pat Buchanan or reading, thinkers from the old right, or anything like that. It was because like he realized everything's a lie and our country was getting screwed. And so anyway, like that summed it up in me, but it also did in like all the people I would argue with, all the friends I would argue with that thought I was nuts, criticizing American foreign policy. So I think the phenomenon as a whole is a thing where it's like the man himself is great. He's funny. I like him. He's entertaining and he's doing good things. But what the man represents and the people that he represents is so much more significant. I mean, that's why I was a little bit black-pilled in 2020 just a little bit, when things went down in the way that they did. I mean, I remember talking to CJ on the phone and we were like, oh no, the world's ending. But the like glimmer of hope that I had is that 70 million Americans are like crawl over broken glass Trump people. And there's a segment of the population that loves America and wants to preserve it, like understands America in one sense or another as a distinct nation and people and wants to keep it going. So that like gives me a lot of hope for the future. But do you think that's misplaced, or do you think think I'm on the ball there?
No, I mean, Trump 2024 is very different than 2016. And in many ways, it couldn't have worked out better. In other words, Biden's victory, so to speak, in 2020, and then Trump coming back and winning decisively, I think that basically is better than if he had squeaked by or had some disputed victory in 2020. There's no doubt about that. And we can understand a lot about what's going on simply by the forces aligned against him. I mean, one thing that Trump has done masterfully is he's brought together the Bushes and the Cheneys and the Clintons and showed us what these people are, which is crazed, deranged, people who want other people to fight all around the globe all the time. And perhaps most importantly, this really shines through even today, is that we forget the fundamental political distinction. When we look at Donald Trump or we listen to him, he doesn't hate our guts. Yeah. Right. I mean, and so he has what George W. Bush had a little bit of, and Bill Clinton had a lot of, which is that, you can drop Trump into a biker bar in Bakersfield, California, and he'd be fine. He'd be buying rounds, and you can drop him into, tea with the Queen, and he's fine. You can't do that with Hillary Clinton. You can't do that with John Kerry. You can't do that with David Frum or Bill Kristol or Kamala Harris, who's still to this day, to me, I don't understand. She's a cipher, one of the strangest political phenomena I've ever seen. It's like just a non-person. Kid couldn't speak. It is. I mean, if you peeled her away like a movie style and there was some robotic wiring, I wouldn't be that shocked. I mean, these people are they are completely people of the air, Luftmenschen. Yeah. They have no connection to anything. They just sort of materialize out of nothing, out of the ether. And they have no connection with anyone. I mean, she's just a beautiful avatar. She's such a great symbol of this sort of brainless neo, whatever we want to call it, political class. I mean, the idea that that person could be a U.S. senator,
Yeah.
it is so it's both hilarious and galling at the same time. You know,
Yeah.
a U.S. senator. I mean, a U.S. senator should be. There's 100 of them on Earth. They should be in the top 5 or even 1% of Americans in terms of intelligence, ability, achievement, courage, character, and yet look what we have. So you know, if somebody wants to say Donald Trump is a rube or a lowbrow, or he's just got this chip on his shoulder from growing up in Queens, and him and his father's family weren't part of the Manhattan smart set, and they resented that, you know, okay, fine. That's America was born of that, you know. And the Scots Irish, the hillbillies, the Appalachians, the Okies, the white trash, you know, those people built this country. And it's okay for them to like him.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, it's kind of like, you know, they say all these things about him. It's like, that's kind of what we wanted. He's like our revenge on the regime that betrayed us. You know, that's another element. Like, you could say all these terrible things about how he doesn't have the decorum, he doesn't respect American institutions or our customs. It's like, good, you know, like, our you norms, let this country on fire. So I hope you are afraid of him. I hope you hate him. You know, like, that's sort of what he represents to me. Like, that leads to one of my, what's that, Jeff?
The left does not get to lecture us about norms.
Exactly.
No, they don't.
No, it's like, I said to him the other day, it's like, the left operates on the model of living constitution for our friends and originalism for our enemies. And that's exactly what they do.
And it's the same way in terms of like moral high ground.
Yeah.
Right. For our enemies, we hold them to the highest possible moral standards. For our friends, they can be doing meth and banging underage prostitutes. Right. Like, that's how they operate. I mean, it was comical too, like the Pete Hegseth confirmation hearings. Like, oh, he's a drunk. And it's like, Nancy Pelosi went to that speech blasted on Tuesday night, and they're telling us that, like, oh, Pete Hegseth might have had one too many beers. You know, it's comical, these people. But anyway, go ahead and make your point.
I mean, so it's actually one of the things that you said is that as long as the economy is good, people will put up with a lot. One of the things that I noticed, like in 2008, 2012, there's always been this sort of tension between the paleo conservatives and the paleo libertarians. And in the 2008, 2012, it was basically the libertarians that were winning out. But I see a lot of people today that look to Buchanan more than Ron Paul on that debate, even though in some respects, a lot of these people are better off than they've been economically. They would actually sacrifice some of their wealth just to have their country back. That's why immigration is like the biggest issue. I mean, everyone's concerned about like cultural fascism online and making fun of minorities, like all these things. But actually, that's the issue that young men care about is culture, even race and ethnos. Like, they're talking about some of these things. So I guess the question for you, Jeff, is like, how would you describe that transition from the paleo libertarians winning out to the Buchananites and the paleo conservatives being the primary emphasis of us millennials?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think for a lot of young men in particular, libertarianism became a straitjacket. It was kind of a cul-de-sac. And a lot of young men put a lot of their time and energy into it when perhaps they should have been putting their time and energy into building a career or a family, which actually does far more benefit than books and podcasts and that sort of thing. So I think we can understand that the hollowing out of the economy and the fact that housing has risen in costs so much faster than wages. Just listening to a real estate guy today talking about Philadelphia and how much things have risen there relative to the average median income, And so, I think a lot of younger people, I have a 19-year-old son, so I'm kind of in touch with what guys his age are thinking and doing in college. And, they feel a little ripped off in terms of their future prospects, for sure. and they feel slighted by feminism, obviously, and the idea that we are going to sort of think tank ourselves forever and ever, or have policy papers or this sort of thing doesn't much appeal to them. What appeals to them is going to the gym. What appeals to them is maybe making some money, online, or doing something that's not a straitjacket. Because again, we talked about elite failure in the 20th century. I mean, this is such an important thing. I mean, you got to understand that the Cato people of the world, they think the 20th century was some sort of liberal triumph.
Yeah.
When in
They
fact,
totally do.
you're right, it was an illiberal disaster. And so you can't easily sort of live with people who think that way.
It's funny,
you're right. So when I think about my son and kids his age and their prospects, I mean, they really don't want ideology. It's just not what they're after.
Yeah.
It's I was listening to the exchange with one of the worst creatures in politics, Gavin Newsom, that he had with Charlie Kirk. And Newsom, obviously, he just lies about everything. But
of course,
one of the funny things is that his son listens to Charlie Kirk, right?
Yeah.
So I know the Sacramento region very well, and I know that young, wealthy kids are probably a lot more right wing than they would tell their parents.
Oh yeah.
And so I think even people in the Democratic Party who have these sons, I think that they're going through the same phenomenon.
Yeah. And
so politics is really open-ended right now. It's not like shut and closed, black pilled forever. There are things at play where things could very rapidly heighten.
Yeah.
I don't know if violence is on the table, but certainly
which
an increased politicization.
Which we are not just to be clear, we condemn all violence.
Of course not. But the point is that I think people are ready to sacrifice for a better world, and that puts the regime in the crosshairs.
I mean, you see this on the right and the left. I mean, the Luigi Mangione thing is to describe it as a shot across the bow. It's an understatement, I guess, but it's like it's a bellwether of the future, I think. And they are extremely, I mean, you had a guy that lit himself on fire to protest Gaza. The left is radical and violent, and willing to engage in violence. And contrarily, on the right, you have young men who are much more willing to engage in radical thought on the right. And you see this breakdown in it politically among the Zoomer generation, and it's largely on lines of sex, right? Young women are very far left, young men very far right. I mean, you see the numbers just in voting for Trump. It broke largely that way, and I think as far as the future goes, young men on the right, and it isn't, like you say, Jeff, it's not necessarily ideological, right? That at least the thing
very anti-ideological.
Yeah, that are driving these things. It's the fact that I want to get married, I want to have a home, I want to have a career, and those things for the average young man are simply not possible. Right. And they know this.
Yeah.
And so they're angry about it. Rightfully so. They see that their grandparents were able to have nice lives, and that doesn't exist for them. They look out at the dating world, and all of the young women are feminists and just hooking up with everybody. That's what they see. And none of them want to get married, even though the young men do. They see that world, and they either despair or they take whatever action they can. I mean, like you said, they go to the gym, they try to make money, they try to improve themselves, but they will also listen to people, tell them, forbidden things. I mean, I think this is why, right? Joe Rogan has, Ian Carroll on his podcast. I don't know when we're releasing this, but it was a couple days ago. And I mean, that guy I don't find particularly impressive, actually, but but he's saying things that
Or edgy, because people want edgy.
are edgy and people
Because
want
they're
edgy. That's why
done-
Joe has him on.
They're
Yeah.
done with the ideological infrastructure that scolded them into basically a very bad mental and spiritual position.
Yes.
They're done with it. They don't care.
Yeah.
And so anything that's going to cater to that, like Trump,
Yeah.
is going to be it's going to further their agenda.
And like you bring up Gavin Newsom's son. I mean, you can't take anything he's saying as true, but say it is true, take it at face value. Like, that's a window into their world. Like, there's even their sons are rebelling against them. And the means of the rebellion is like, I like Trump, I like Charlie Kirk, or I like guys that are even more radical than them.
Yeah.
And
that's what he tells us, Dad. Charlie Kirk.
Exactly. He's telling him he's listening to Charlie Kirk, but it's way worse from Gavin's
but he's
perspective.
actually listening to PQ.
Yes, maybe. Yeah. And so anyway, I think, as things continue to develop in the future, like I think that is going to continue more, right? It's going to become more stark along those lines. And it's a reason for optimism, but also, I don't know, something to be a little leery of, right?
Buy land and prepare.
Yeah, buy land, find your tribe, and get with your people, right?
Yeah. Do you have any? I mean, do you have any advice from that angle? I mean, you've been
a lot of Zoomers listen to us.
Yeah.
A lot of the guys that we just described.
A lot of younger guys. I mean, Jeff, you've been through the era of like, stock up your gold because it's all going to end now. But like, do you have any practical advice? I know it's like, I hate that question personally when I get it, but like, since it's out there,
I love it.
I want to throw it at you, Jeff. Like, what advice would you give people?
Well, I would certainly, if you want to go to college and you feel you must, because for a lot of things you need not, and should not. But if you feel that you must, go slow. Try to go to community college those first couple of years. Don't incur debt. Take your time. It's better to graduate at 25 with no debt than 22 with debt, because so many young people, they sort of go lockstep. The high school counselors are still selling them this garbage, a National Honor Society, AP classes, and then you got to go get a good SAT and go to this or that college. Okay, well, you go to this or that college, what do you really learn? There's still this lockstep mentality that an undergraduate degree is absolutely necessary, when that's not true. So I would just caution against that for starters, and then just think about, the sad truth is that young people are going to have to think a lot more about how they're going to bring in income. They're going to have to be more entrepreneurial in their mindset, because, I mean, we talked about the baby boomers. I mean, they could spend their early 20s, smoking pot, traipsing through Europe, getting a 2.5 at State U at virtually no cost, and then still go become a doctor, lawyer, accountant, teacher, whatever it might be. It was just wide open for them. And now, I mean, I have a niece who's applying to medical schools, and she, very smart, sweet girl, very hardworking. She went to UCLA, took all the really hard biology and chemistry, and she got very high grades, did very well on the, I guess it's called the MCAT. She's taking a year off working in a doctor's office and applying to medical schools, and I mean, her chances are very low. She lives in California. She's not, the Berkeleys and the UCLA's are and even her sort of second tier things like the UC Irvines are apparently unlikely, from what I'm told anyway. And so and she's done all the extracurriculars, studied, worked hard, and so you just say, well, what is this? That's an absurd system. And is it really worth trying to game it, doing all the things you have to do in high school, extracurricular, to go to this top college? And then I'm just not sure it's worth it anymore. So start with that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's similar to what we would say too. And like, I mean, there's all the little things like get out of debt and stuff like that. But I mean, like I would say too, like another thing is you need to be like getting yourself ready physically, your diet, get as much land as you can and just own things of yourself. And I mean, a lot of people are not ready for this. They're not ready for this new age. And I don't, even if you can be optimistic about Trump and what Elon can like do with it, like I don't know how far Doge is going to go, but there still has to be some sort of cataclysm. You still have to face the music because it's still coming.
Well, yeah, it's baked into the cards. Like I right before we went on, I saw a fascinating, infographic just about the demographic changes since 1960. Not in terms of race or ethnicity or anything, but just the breakdowns of households in the United States between single, married with children.
Yeah.
And basically in 1960, like 50% of the country was a household that had children in it.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's like 25%.
Yeah.
And so 75% of the country has no stake in the future whatsoever. And it's going to continue to get way worse, right? There, like every incentive to not, every disincentive to not get married, not have children is built into our entire social structure. And so like you have to be cognizant of like the long-term trends of the country, that like just that alone, not even including the fact that we're importing millions of people from foreign countries here, and I mean even we still are, right? And I'm just talking like legal immigration is still way too high. And so I mean you think of all these things together, plus economically what is destined to take place. You have to think long and hard about like what are you going to do with the decades that you're given, right? And how do you prepare for a world that is probably going to get much worse before it gets better?
Yeah. Let me jump in there with one last question, Jeff, and then we can wrap things up. I don't want to take too much of your time, but my last question is, where do you sit on things like political action at the state level and local level versus national action, especially on the Trump, momentum? There's a lot of momentum there, but like, where do you sit on all that? Like, is there any relevance to even state and local politics at all, or should people just be avoiding it and just ignore it? It's all a waste of time.
No, I think you shouldn't ignore it. I think you should engage in it. However, however much you might not care to, I think it's important to do so. And I wouldn't have said that certainly 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago. I mean, this pipe dream, the idea of a non-political world is almost a bigger pipe dream than a libertarian world, right? I mean, and there was the idea that politics is interested in us, wanting an end of a politicized America is sort of like as sort of absurd as what Francis Fukuyama wants, right? I mean, we mentioned him earlier. I mean, it's like saying, well, the battle is on the battle at present is on the beaches of Normandy, but I'm busy still digging World War I trenches over at the Somme. It's like, it doesn't matter what you want. You're an adult and you accept the world as it is and you face it as it is. So, I happen to live in the state of Alabama, which is about 5 million people, which is roughly equivalent to, let's say, Norway. So at least prior to mass immigration, a country like Norway, which is very cohesive, could really do some things. And, we might call it socialist, whatever you want to say. Yeah. But among other things, Norway has, I believe, the single biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world because of their offshore oil reserves. You own the oil out to, I guess, 11 miles or whatever, 11 or 12 miles, whatever the offshore thing is. And so as a result of that, Norway could basically pay all of its citizens, endless Social Security or whatever, without struggling too much. Now, I don't think that's exactly what they do with their sovereign wealth fund. They go around and invest just like a lot of other sovereign wealth funds do. But nonetheless, in a state like Alabama, where I live, I'm a person of no particular contacts or renown, but I am able to go to the Federal Society lunches and meet the Supreme Court justices and know them a little bit and get their phone numbers. I'm probably 2 phone calls away from the governor's office. I'm probably 1 phone call away from my U.S. rep or my my Alabama rep. I mean, it's you know, I know the attorney general, I know the treasurer of the state. It's just very, very different ball game. Versus, you know, I mean, CJ coming from the Sacramento area. I mean, California is what, 40 million people, 45 million people now.
Yeah.
And so just so much wealth there as well makes you just a lot more, you know. So, but even if you're in California, you know, in your little area, you could have an effect. And ignoring politics doesn't make it go away. That's just the plain fact. And so we just have to stop ignoring it.
Yeah, I mean, like that's one of the things that I've learned too in the last couple of years is that, especially at the local and regional county level, politics is very accessible, and we're not going through these political trajectories alone. A lot of other people, it's like not to use a very scary word to James Lindsay, but there's a sort of dialectic at play, and we're all part of it. And so, like, there are a lot of people on our side, and so you can do things politically, and people aren't comfortable with it yet, but they can be very popular. And I would also encourage pay attention to local and state. And now that the Trump, you know, administration has sort of given permission for local level people to be right wing, let's take advantage of it and let's do it. So I want to basically end it there, Jeff, unless you have any last words for us. I'll leave it up to you. But other than that, like, I appreciate your time, and I am very thankful to all of the work that the Ron Paul era. They were voices in the wilderness, and we became politically conscious. And I think what that caused is it caused us to take no particular interest in the narratives and ideology that the regime was trying to shove down our throats. And that set us up to be better quality dissidents. So,
well, absolutely. I agree 100%. And I really appreciate you guys having me on.
Cool. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff.